The Great Pyramid, the last surviving wonder of the ancient world. Historians and Egyptologists tell us that it was built by the Egyptian Old Kingdom pharaoh, Khufu, whom they believe lived around 2600 BC. But with only the writings of the ancient historian Herodotus, naming Khufu as the pyramid's builder, why are Egyptologists so convinced that the monument was constructed by this ancient pharaoh? In the spring of 1837, a British antiquarian and pyramid explorer, Colonel Richard William Howard Vyse, discovered a series of 4 hidden chambers, deep inside the Great Pyramid. These 4 chambers had been sealed since the monument's construction, and had to be blasted open by Colonel Vyse using gunpowder. It was a difficult, and highly dangerous operation, but with much perseverance, the British colonel was eventually rewarded by becoming the first person in thousands of years to access these hidden spaces. Each chamber was about 37 feet long, 16 feet wide, and, with the exception of the topmost chamber, they were around 3 feet in height, and could be explored only by crawling through them on hands and knees. As Vyse opened and explored each of these hidden rooms in turn, he hoped that eventually one of them would present to him the true burial chamber of the pharaoh Khufu. But the colonel was to be disappointed, for upon entry to each of these small chambers, he found them to be completely devoid of any ancient burial, no mummy, no sarcophagus, no grave goods, and absolutely no treasure. The only discovery of significance within these small chambers were some red ochre markings that had been crudely painted upon the chamber walls, and, among these markings it is claimed, was found the royal name of Khufu. This discovery in 1837 has long been regarded by Egyptologists as definitive proof that Khufu had indeed built the Great Pyramid as his eternal tomb, just as Herodotus had claimed thousands of years before. During his time at Giza, the British colonel tasked one of his assistants, Mr. Hill, with making one-to-one facsimile copies of all the painted markings the colonel claimed to have discovered in these chambers, and which the colonel would later send to the British Museum. There, all 28 facsimile drawings made by Mr. Hill have been stored away in a large portfolio folder, and can still be seen at the museum to this day. But no sooner had Colonel Vyse published the details of his pyramid operations at Giza in a 3-volume account, than questioning voices began to emerge that challenged the authenticity of the painted markings, including the famous Khufu cartouche Vyse claimed to have discovered. The first of these doubters was a Prussian prince, Hermann von Puckler-Muskau, who, after meeting Vyse at Giza in 1837, claimed in his own book published several years later, that the British explorer had merely pretended to have discovered the chamber markings, and that they were likely painted onto the chamber walls only recently. Another account, which also cast doubt on Vyse's claimed discovery of the Khufu cartouche, appeared over a century later, when best-selling author, Zecharia Sitchin, presented in his 1980 book, Journeys to the Mythical Past, a curious account from amateur genealogist, Walter Allen of Pennsylvania. In this account, Allen informed Sitchin that his great-grandfather, a man named Humphreys Brewer, had apparently worked with the British colonel at Giza during his operations there in 1837, and that a story had been passed down the family generations from his great-grandfather, that a fraud had indeed taken place in the Great Pyramid, during Vyse's operations there. During discussions with some elderly family relatives in 1954, it seems from the information that was passed down, which Allen noted down in his ham radio logbook, there had been a dispute in Vyse's camp between some of his men, and it seems, where accusations of fraud had been made. In his logbook, Walter Allen presents this brief account of his great-grandfather's time at Giza in 1837.
He joined Colonel Vyse, exploring Giza pyramids. Had dispute with Raven and Hill, about painted marks in pyramid. Faint marks were repainted, some were new. Had words with a Mr. Hill, and Vyse, when he left. He agreed with a Colonel Colin Campbell, and another, Gino Cabilia. Humphreys went back to England, late 1837.
It seems that having made these accusations of fraud, Vyse instantly dismissed the accuser, and permanently banished him from the Giza site. In his book, Journeys to the Mythical Past, Zecharia Sitchin further tells us.
Other entries, and a letter from an uncle, confirmed the basic facts regarding Humphreys Brewer. Who he was, his time in Egypt, his dispute with Vyse and Hill, and his banishment from Giza.
Given the somewhat ambiguous nature of Walter Allen's account, many have come to believe, including some members of Walter Allen's family, that it was Allen's great-grandfather, Humphreys Brewer, who had the dispute with Raven and Hill, and that it was Brewer who had made the accusation of fraud, before being dismissed and banished from the site by Colonel Vyse. However, new evidence from the Colonel's private journal, which he wrote during his time at Giza, suggests that this view is incorrect, and that it was another of Vyse's workers who had been at the center of the dispute with the fraud accusation, and who, as a result of this, was banned from the site by the British Colonel. It seems, from Walter Allen's account, that his great-grandfather was indeed present at the time to witness this dispute, and that, soon afterwards, he also departed Giza, perhaps in a show of solidarity for the man Vyse had actually dismissed. But before leaving, it seems the young Mr. Brewer had a few choice words of his own, with Colonel Vyse and Mr. Hill. But what is the truth to all of this? Critics of Zechariah Sitchin have pointed out that Colonel Vyse kept meticulous records of all those that had worked for him during his operations at Giza, and that there is no record of anyone named Humphreys Brewer in any of the Colonel's published works. The implication here is that the claim of fraudulent activity in the Great Pyramid that Sitchin had learned from Walter Allen is nothing more than hearsay, and, at worst, itself a fraud. In this short documentary, we will explore the events at Giza during this time, in particular between the dates of 6th to 10th of May 1837. These dates are significant, since it was during this time that Colonel Vyse opened and explored Lady Arbuthnot's chamber, the third of the 4 hidden chambers he had discovered within the Great Pyramid. This chamber was named by Vyse in honor of Lady Anne Arbuthnot, the wife of Sir Robert Arbuthnot, a Scottish civil servant who had been passing through Egypt at the time, on his return to India. Lady Arbuthnot's chamber has, by some considerable margin, more painted marks upon its walls than any other chamber within the Great Pyramid. It stands to reason therefore, that if any irregular activity had been occurring, with painted markings being fraudulently placed on the chamber walls, as has been claimed, then it is more likely that such nefarious activity would have been spotted with this particular chamber. The logic is simple. More markings would require more time to prepare the walls, more paint to apply, more visits to and from the chamber, more time needed to complete the job, and thus an overall increased likelihood that someone could have noticed any fraudulent activity that may have been going on. So, was a fraud perpetrated in this chamber by Colonel Vyse in May 1837? Let us now consider the evidence. Lady Arbuthnot's chamber was opened by Colonel Vyse and his team on May 6, 1837. The moment of its opening is described in Volume 1 of Vyse's published work, Operations Carried Out at Giza.
May 6th. The chamber above Nelson's, afterwards called Lady Arbuthnot's, was opened, and in the course of the afternoon, I entered it with Mr. Raven.
The published opening date Vyse gives for this chamber, of May 6, is highly significant, as we shall see later in this documentary. Significant also, is that this May 6 opening date, is also confirmed in the Colonel's private journal, his field notes describing the discoveries and explorations he made during his time at Giza. In his May 6 private journal entry, the Colonel writes,
Saturday, 6th May, 1837. Mr. Raven returned from the Great Pyramid, and was pleased we were ready for a look into the room above Nelson's. We then paid the people off.
There can be little doubt then, that Lady Arbuthnot's chamber was indeed opened on May 6. So, what, if anything, did the two men, Vyse and Raven, find within the chamber, during their exploration of it later that day? The Colonel's published account leaves us in little doubt.
We found this apartment, of the same description and nearly of the same dimensions as the others below it, being 37 feet 4 inches, by 16 feet 4 inches. Like the rest, it was quite empty, and built in the same manner, but with less care, and with a greater proportion of calcareous stone on the northern and southern sides. The excavation was continued, in order to get above it.
And that's it. That is all the Colonel writes in his published account of his exploration of this chamber with Mr. Raven on the afternoon of May 6, 1837. Now, noticeable here by its complete absence is any mention of any painted marks having been found by the two men during this exploration. And it's not possible to put such a glaring oversight down to a mere lack of interest in these inscriptions, since Colonel Vyse well understood their importance, writing just days earlier on May 3rd.
Foundations might everywhere be traced under the sands, and shafts, lined with unburnt bricks, amongst which probably a cartouche might be found, which would determine the date of the constructions.
In the footnote, on this page, the Colonel adds the following remark.
Much information might possibly be obtained from the cartouches on the bricks in the various ruins in Egypt.
Now, given the Colonel's awareness of the importance of these ancient marks on the various ruins around Egypt, why then is there complete radio silence from him on any discovery of any marks in this chamber upon it being opened and explored by not one, but by two men on this day? But this absence of a report from this day of any painted markings being found is odd for some other reasons.
We know that the Colonel and Mr. Raven were clearly able to observe various aspects of this new chamber during their initial exploration of it on May 6. Vyse notes, for example, that the chamber walls had been built with less care, and that there was a greater proportion of limestone blocks in the walls of this chamber than in the two chambers that he had previously opened. This comment naturally implies that the two men were actively inspecting the walls of this new chamber, and yet, they apparently saw nothing upon them. Not a single inscription is reported from this inspection in Vyse's private or published accounts. And it seems that the men were in no particular hurry with their exploration of the chamber, since Colonel Vyse tells us that during this inspection, the two men spent time taking measurements. This indicates, of course, that lighting wasn't a problem, nor for that matter, the chamber's air quality. And the complete absence of a report from May 6 of a discovery of any wall markings is all the more baffling when we consider that in the two near-identical chambers below Lady Arbuthnot's that the Colonel had previously opened, he claimed to have found painted markings upon the walls of those chambers on the very day they were opened. Given this, it is not unreasonable to consider that Vyse and Raven would have been entirely anticipating finding similar wall markings in Lady Arbuthnot's chamber, and would almost certainly have made it a clear objective of their first exploration to thoroughly check the walls of the new chamber for such markings.
And yet, in a chamber that was explored by two men and which was later found to present more painted marks upon its walls than all the other chambers combined, including the first clear examples of the royal cartouche of Khufu, not a single mark was found during the initial inspection. It's almost as though the markings we see in this chamber so easily today simply were not present when Vyse and Raven first opened and explored this chamber. All of which is very strange, to say the least. But stranger still is what happened next.
Within the four small chambers that Colonel Vyse discovered, he placed a dedication inscription upon one wall of each chamber, dedicating each to renowned British dignitaries, such as the Duke of Wellington, Lord Nelson, and so forth. Beneath each name in the dedication inscription, he included the date when the particular chamber had been opened and first explored. As shown earlier in this documentary, Colonel Vyse's private and published accounts unequivocally show us that Lady Arbuthnot's chamber was opened and first explored on May 6, 1837, by the Colonel, accompanied by Mr. Raven. There is no doubt about this. Oddly, however, the dedication inscription we observe in this chamber today presents a truly bizarre contradiction. Instead of May 6, as we would have expected, the chamber's dedication inscription tells us that it was opened on May 9, 3 days later. So, not only do we find that the Colonel made no claim of any discovery of painted marks in this chamber on May 6, when he and Mr. Raven first explored it, now we find that he has altered the date when this chamber was opened to May 9. Critics have tried to explain this anomaly by suggesting that Mr. Hill, who was responsible for painting the dedication inscriptions into the chambers, simply made a mistake when painting this date onto the wall, or that this May 9th date simply represents the date when Mr. Hill actually carried out the painting job in this chamber. However, we can categorically dispel such a notion, since the Colonel himself, in a number of other documents, actually confirms May 9th as the opening date of Lady Arbuthnot's chamber, thereby contradicting what he tells us in his published account. As mentioned previously, in addition to painting each chamber's dedication inscription, Vyse had also tasked Mr. Hill with the job of making one-to-one facsimile drawings of all of the painted marks on the walls of each chamber, like the one here. Mr. Hill produced a total of 6 facsimile drawings from Lady Arbuthnot's chamber, and on each of the 6 drawings, Colonel Vyse wrote this confirmation statement.
These are, as far as circumstances will admit, an exact facsimile of the characters which are found upon the walls of Lady Arbuthnot's chamber in the Great Pyramid of Giza, opened on the 9th of May 1837.
Clearly, this May 9th opening date represents a complete contradiction by Colonel Vyse. On the one hand, he tells us in his published book and in his private journal that Lady Arbuthnot's chamber had been opened on May 6th, but we find its dedication inscription states that it was opened 3 days later, on May 9th, as does the confirmation statement written by Vyse on the 6 facsimile drawings Mr. Hill made from this chamber. Surely now, we have to ask, why do we find this contradiction in the Colonel's writings, and how can it be resolved? The answer to this contradiction may be found when we now consider the Colonel's published entry of May 9th, when he writes,
May 9th. Lady Arbuthnot's chamber was minutely examined, and found to contain a great many quarry marks.
Joining up the dots here, we find a curious concordance arising. On the chamber's falsely stated opening date of May 9th, we learn that a great many quarry marks were also apparently found on this date. Which begs the obvious question, is this May 9th agreement between the chamber's falsely stated opening date and the eventual discovery of a profusion of painted marks within the chamber on this same date merely a simple coincidence? Or is there perhaps something more sinister at play here?
The truth to all of this may simply be what Walter Allen's family account of the events at Giza in 1837 have told us all along, that faint marks were repainted, some were new. In short, a fraud may very well have been perpetrated within the Great Pyramid, and these contradictory dates from Colonel Vyse are in fact clues pointing towards such an occurrence. In this scenario, we can hypothesize that not a single painted mark was discovered by Colonel Vyse and Mr. Raven when they first explored Lady Arbuthnot's chamber on May 6th, and that Vyse arranged to have suitable marks painted onto the walls at some point between 6th and 9th of May, while he was away in Cairo. And so we begin to perceive the Colonel's simple plan. Shift the chamber's true opening date 3 days forward, from May 6th to May 9th, in order to give one of his workers sufficient time to paint fake marks onto the chamber walls. Vyse would then inform his desired witnesses that the chamber was first opened on May 9th, and that this was also the date that the painted markings in the chamber had also been discovered. All of this would have meant that the chamber's true opening date of May 6th would have to be entirely expunged from the Colonel's official account, with only May 9th being reported in his book as the date the chamber was opened, and when the painted marks were found. In this plan, we were simply never meant to know about the chamber's true opening date of May 6th. This scenario also explains why Vyse had Mr. Hill paint the May 9th date into the chamber's dedication inscription. In this scenario, there is no awkward time gap between the date the chamber was opened and the painted marks discovered. At least, this was likely to have been the Colonel's plan. So why did Vyse not follow the plan through? Why, in his published account, does he reveal the chamber's true opening date of May 6th? Why wasn't this information expunged from his published work, as he had likely planned? Why permit this awkward time gap between opening the chamber and discovering the painted marks to be known? Because unexpected events, as we shall shortly see, overtook the Colonel. This event forced Vyse into reining in his planned deception, and to reveal the truth of the chamber's opening. The source of the Colonel's apparent change of mind would appear to have come from one of his assistants at Giza, a man named John Shea Perrin. Without a doubt, Mr. Perrin was very well acquainted with the painted marks in these chambers, including the many marks in Lady Arbuthnot's chamber. Like Mr. Hill, John Perrin had also been commissioned by Vyse to make a complete survey of the chambers, including the production of small-scale drawings from the chamber walls, which Perrin duly fulfilled. On May 19, the Colonel assembled his witnesses, Arbuthnot, Brettel, Raven, and himself, to attest to the accuracy of Mr. Hill's various facsimile drawings, and crucially, to attest also to the May 9 opening date of Lady Arbuthnot's chamber, that Vyse had written onto each facsimile sheet. Curiously though, even although he was present at Giza at the time, and without doubt, the person best placed to consider the drawings, Mr. Perrin was not invited by Vyse to the attestation meeting. Given Perrin's knowledge and standing, this seems a very odd exclusion, but the reason for it may simply be that Mr. Perrin was not prepared to attest to something that he knew to be untrue, that is, Colonel Vyse's written claim that Lady Arbuthnot's chamber had been opened on May 9. 2 years later, in 1839, Colonel Vyse must have been truly horrified when Mr. Perrin published his own account of the operations at Giza, noting very clearly in his publication that Lady Arbuthnot's chamber had been discovered, not on May 9, but on May 6. This revelation, from Perrin's book, would have been a complete bombshell to Colonel Vyse's own planned publication, that would come a year later. Had the Colonel continued with his plan, and published that Lady Arbuthnot's chamber had been opened on May 9, he would have been exposing himself to some very awkward questions, when people noticed the contradictory opening date between the two men. It seems then, that the safest, and most discreet option for the Colonel, was to agree with Perrin's date, alter his own narrative by reverting to the chamber's true opening date of May 6, and thereby avoid any unpleasant, and potential difficulties, by publishing his false date of May 9. However, as a consequence of reining in his plan, the painted marks in Lady Arbuthnot's chamber were now cast adrift from the now revised chamber opening date of May 6. But there would, now, have been a contradiction between Vyse's published account of May 6, being the chamber's opening date, and the chamber's dedication inscription which, to this day, still gives May 9 as the opening date, as does Mr. Hill's drawings in the British Museum. But in 1840, when Vyse published his book, Lady Arbuthnot's chamber, with its contradictory date, was too remote a place for the vast majority of the world's population to ever visit, let alone have all the available facts to hand, from which to notice such a discrepancy. Similarly, Mr. Hill's facsimile sheets were tucked away in their portfolio binder at the British Museum, where, in the near 200 years they have been stored there, very few people have ever asked to view them. Vyse could have felt fairly comfortable that the contradiction in his published works would never be noticed, since all the available evidence was quite disparate, and fairly difficult at that time to access. With the evidence of this date contradiction being held in places that were largely remote from each other, it would have been almost impossible for anyone at that time to join up the dots and figure out what had really happened at Giza in 1837. But there is, however, one final place that is very close to home, where Colonel Vyse's contradiction could still have surfaced and caught him out. His very own published book. In the second volume of the Colonel's published work, we find in the book's index that there is an entry titled Inscriptions, and that it is to be found on page 145 of the volume. Turning to this page, we find that it provides us with a verbatim log of all the inscriptions that Colonel Vyse added to various monuments and artifacts during his time in Egypt, including, as we observe here, the inscriptions in each of the 4 hidden chambers that he discovered. As we have seen, the dedication inscription in Lady Arbuthnot's chamber gives May 9 as its opening date, and that this date is confirmed by Vyse on 6 of Mr. Hill's facsimile drawings from this chamber. All we need then do is compare the verbatim text of Vyse's published inscription for Lady Arbuthnot's chamber with the actual inscription from this chamber, and we should find that they both give May 9, thereby placing a contradiction right there in the Colonel's published work, whereby in the early part of his book, the Colonel has reverted to May 6 as the chamber's opening date, but the chamber's dedication inscription printed in this section of his book should show us May 9 because that is what this inscription actually says, and we can see that it says this, even today. And now matters become truly bizarre. When we check this inscription text, as it is presented in Colonel Vyse's published account, we find that he has altered the date of the inscription text, which now reads May 6th. By doing this, Vyse has ensured that the date given in this section of his book matches his May 6th entry in his published account, and thus removes what would have been a very revealing and easily found contradiction in his published account.
Colonel Vyse gives no indication anywhere in his book that he has misrepresented this chamber's dedication inscription date, or even why he altered it. Nor is there any mention of this change being the result of a simple printing error, since it is not listed in the errata section at the end of the Colonel's book. It rather seems that Vyse was forced by Mr. Perring's revelation into changing the dedication inscription date we find in his book to read May 6, and that he did so in order to prevent what would have been a blatant contradiction from arising in his own book had he published the dedication inscription's true date of May 9th. In short, what we are probably observing here is nothing less than a forgery that went wrong, followed by an attempted cover-up.
Anyone lucky enough to visit Lady Arbuthnot's chamber today can easily sense the truth of this attempted cover-up by simply observing the contradictory dedication inscription painted onto the wall of this chamber, speaking in silent testimony to the botched deception of the British pyramid explorer, Colonel Vyse.
The information in this video is based upon research by author Scott Crichton. These books are available from the publisher, Inner Traditions, Bear and Company, online at Amazon.com, and from all good bookstores.